I found a knife under my father's floorboards. I think I know what it means. Before I start, I need you to understand something. I've been sitting in front of this camera for 3 days, trying to figure out how to begin. I've written and deleted the opening maybe 40 times, because every time I start, I realize there's no version of this story that ends well for me. There's no version where I say these words out loud and then go back to living a normal life. But I'm saying them anyway, because I think if I don't, nobody will. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what I found. And what I found means my father, a man who spent 30 years telling other people what justice looks like, was something I don't have a clean word for. So, let's go back to the beginning. My father died on a Tuesday in February. Not dramatically. Not the way a man of his stature probably imagined. No courtroom, no final ruling, no last word delivered from some elevated position. He died in the passenger seat of a hospital shuttle van, somewhere between the radiology ward and the oncology wing, during what should have been a routine imaging appointment. His heart just stopped. The driver didn't notice for almost 8 minutes. By then, it didn't matter. The funeral was enormous. I don't mean that in a warm way. I mean it the way you'd describe a military exercise, organized, orchestrated, attended by people who needed to be seen attending. 3 sitting judges, 2 state senators, the current district attorney who had clerked under my father in 1998 and never missed an opportunity to mention it in campaign materials. There were flowers I'd never seen before, arrangements so large they had to be brought in through the side entrance of the church. Someone had hired a string quartet. I didn't hire a string quartet. I don't know who did. I stood at the front of the church and shook hands for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know the exact time, because I watched the clock above the vestibule door the entire time, counting minutes the way you count seconds when you're holding your breath underwater. People said things like, "Your father was the conscience of this county." People said things like, "He was the last honest man." People said things like, "He shaped the law into something that actually meant something." And I nodded. And I said thank you. And I meant none of it. Not because I hated my father, but because I had never fully understood him. He was the kind of man who existed in perpendicular to you. You could be in the same room for 30 years and still feel like you were viewing him through glass. He was, and I want to be precise about this, because it matters for everything that comes later, a genuinely impressive person. I don't say that to lionize him. I say it because the gap between who he appeared to be and what I now believe he was is the actual horror of this story. You can't understand one without the other. Honorable Judge Raymond Calloway, 31 years on the Superior Court bench. Before that, a decade as a prosecutor with a conviction rate that people in the legal community still cite at conferences. Before that, law review, full scholarship, the kind of academic record that gets framed and hung in department hallways. He grew up poor, genuinely poor, not the curated poor that politicians perform on campaign trails, but the kind of poor where your mother works 2 jobs and you learn to cook because nobody else is home. And he turned that into a story he told carefully, strategically, at the right moments, to the right audiences. It was effective. Everything my father did was effective. He was respected the way infrastructure is respected. Not loved, exactly. Not warmly, but trusted, depended upon. The kind of person around whom systems organize themselves. And he raised me alone. From the time I was 5 years old, it was just him and me in that house, because my mother left. That's what he told me. That's what he always told me. She left. She couldn't handle the pressure of his career, the long hours, the emotional distance. She left in the spring of 1999 when I was 5 years old, and she didn't say goodbye, and she never came back. And he didn't talk about her because talking about her hurt him. And I should understand that some people aren't built for the long road, and that was that. I accepted this for 26 years. Not happily, not without grief. I spent a significant portion of my 20s in therapy working through what it means to be abandoned by a parent, the specific flavor of wound it leaves, the way it makes you suspicious of permanence, the way you're always braced for people to disappear. My therapist, a careful woman who chose her words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, once told me that the pain of parental abandonment is complicated by the fact that you can't fully grieve something that doesn't have a defined ending. There's no funeral, no date, just an absence that becomes load-bearing in your psychology over time. I accepted that my mother left because my father told me she left, and my father was a superior court judge. And superior court judges, I had been taught, explicitly and implicitly in every exchange we'd ever had, do not lie. I want you to hold on to that, because it becomes the foundation of everything. When he died, the house became mine. It's a large house, not ostentatious. My father would have considered ostentation a form of moral failure, but solid, substantial. The kind of house that says, I have been here and I intend to remain. 4 bedrooms. A large formal study on the ground floor with built-in bookshelves and a fireplace that hadn't been used since I was a teenager. Original hardwood floors throughout, dark and slightly uneven, the kind of floor that records every footstep. The house was built in 1961. My father bought it in 1988, before I was born, before my mother, before everything. I moved in 6 weeks after the funeral because the alternative was paying rent on my apartment while also maintaining the property taxes and utilities on the house. And I'm 31 years old with a freelance contract that pays adequately but not generously. And the math was simple. I want to be honest, the move wasn't purely financial. There was something else pulling me there. Some part of me believed, stupidly maybe, that living in the house would tell me something about my father that I'd never been able to access while he was alive. That the house itself contained some version of him that the public man never showed. I was right about that. I was catastrophically right. The first few weeks were administrative. Estate lawyers, bank accounts, the slow, bureaucratic digestion of a life. My father was organized by César, obsessively so, and his files were meticulous. Every tax return since 1979, every insurance policy, current and lapsed. His will was 12 pages long and contained exactly 0 surprises. I also started cleaning, because the house needed it, not because it was dirty in the way of neglect, but because it was saturated with him. His presence was in every surface, his reading glasses on the side table, his annotated legal texts, 2 shelves of them, each with his narrow, precise handwriting in the margins. His clothes, still in the closet, still smelling faintly of the cedar sachets he'd kept there since I was a child. I started in the easy rooms, kitchen, bathrooms, the upstairs bedrooms. I donated clothes, threw away expired medications, made decisions about which pieces of furniture to keep and which to put in storage. I worked methodically. I needed something to be methodical about. The study I avoided. This isn't symbolic hindsight. I genuinely avoided it. The study was the room most saturated with his professional identity. The judge's chambers he'd created for himself at home, the room where he worked evenings and weekends, the room with the closed door that I had been implicitly and explicitly trained throughout my entire childhood not to enter without permission. Even as an adult, standing in my own house, I'd walk past the study door and feel the same slight muscular contraction I'd felt as a child. The door had a specific quality of closeness that other doors in the house didn't have. I'm not making this into a metaphor. I'm describing a genuine Pavlovian response that I had developed over 30 years of being told, in various ways, that this room was not for me. I put the study off until week 4. When I finally opened the door, the smell hit me first. Books, old paper, the particular mustiness of a room that has been sealed, not entirely, but mostly, against fresh air for years. There was something else underneath it, something I couldn't immediately identify, something organic and faintly sour, the way certain old wood smells when moisture has been working on it for a long time. The room was exactly as he'd left it. His desk, a massive, dark walnut piece that had always looked to me like a piece of judicial furniture, a desk that passed judgment on anyone who sat before it, was covered in neat stacks of papers and journals. His leather desk chair, worn smooth at the armrests from decades of use. The walls of books, floor to ceiling on 3 sides, the spines arranged with the rigid organizational logic he applied to everything. And the floor. The floor of the study was the same dark hardwood as the rest of the house, but it was covered in the middle section by a large Persian rug, burgundy and dark blue, geometric patterns, heavy and old. My father had owned this rug for as long as I could remember. It was one of the few things in the house that I would have called beautiful, though it had always struck me as slightly out of place, too ornate for a man who otherwise furnished his spaces with function in mind rather than aesthetics. I remember standing in the doorway for a long moment before entering. The sound the floorboard made under my first step into that room, a low, resonant creak that travelled up through the sole of my shoe and into the bones of my foot, was exactly the sound I remembered from childhood. 30 years and that board had made the same sound. There's something almost obscene about that kind of consistency. I started at the desk, spent the better part of 2 days going through papers, sorting into piles, things to keep, things to shred, things to give to the estate lawyer. My father's notes were dense and efficient. He thought the way he spoke, in complete, structured sentences, with a clear hierarchy of importance. Reading his handwriting was like listening to him lecture, controlled, deliberate, every word doing exactly the work. Work it was meant to do. I found nothing extraordinary in the papers. Legal notes, case references, personal correspondence, mostly formal, a few letters from former clerks, a card from the DA, the one who'd been at the funeral, written in 2019, marking 30 years since my father had first taken the bench. Everything I know about the law, I learned from you. I put it in the discard pile. I'm not sure why. Something about the way it was signed felt performative. The books took another day. I wasn't reading them, just pulling them off the shelves, shaking them out. My father occasionally used papers as bookmarks, and I didn't want to throw anything away unexamined, and deciding keep or donate. Most of them were going to the local law school library. They had expressed interest when I'd contacted them, and it seemed fitting. Behind the 3rd shelf from the left, near the bottom, I found a small cardboard box, about the size of a shoebox, that had been pushed back against the wall. It wasn't hidden exactly. It was just back there, in the dark space behind the books, the way things accumulate in spaces that are rarely disturbed. The box contained photographs, not family photographs, and I'd found those elsewhere in an album in the hall closet. These were different. These were professional photographs mostly, events, ceremonies, that kind of thing. My father at various stages of his career, always in the same posture, upright, square-shouldered, slightly apart from the people around him, even when standing in a group. A man who occupied his own space in every frame. And then I got to the rug. I'd pulled the rug aside to clean under it, the kind of thing you do when you're doing a thorough job. And that's when I noticed that one of the floorboards at the edge of the exposed section was not quite the same as the others. It was a small thing, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, if you were standing at normal height and looking at it from a distance. But I was on my hands and knees with a cleaning rag, and I was close to the floor, and I could see it clearly. The board had been replaced. Not recently, but at some point after the rest of the floor had been laid, definitely. The grain was slightly different, the staining slightly uneven, the way it sat in relation to the surrounding boards a degree or two off from perfectly flush. It had been done carefully, by someone who knew what they were doing. But wood tells the truth eventually, if you know how to look. I ran my finger along the edge of the board. There was a gap, thin, maybe 2 millimeters, but consistent along the full length of the board, and the wood gave slightly under pressure, not the solid resistance of a properly seated floorboard, something with air beneath it. I got up and went to the kitchen and found a flathead screwdriver, I want to try to describe what happened next with absolute precision, because I've been over it in my head so many times that the details have started to feel slippery. Some of them vivid to the point of physical nausea. Some of them strangely blurred, the way your memory protects you from things by softening their edges just enough to be bearable. I inserted the screwdriver into the gap at one end of the board. The board resisted at first. Whatever seal had formed over the years, moisture, slight warping, the compressed accumulation of time, it held for a moment. I had to apply real pressure. The screwdriver bit into the edge of the wood with a sound like a tooth cracking. Not a clean crack, a fracturing sound, wet and fibrous. Then the board came up. I still think about what I expected to find. Given the moment, the atmosphere of the room, the strangeness of the replaced board, I think I expected something almost mundane. A hidden compartment for valuables, the kind of thing people do when they don't trust banks. Emergency cash, jewelry, maybe documents, something a careful man would want to keep secure. The cavity was roughly 18 inches wide and about 2 feet long, maybe 4 inches deep, just a hollow in the subfloor, bordered by the joists on either side. The first thing I registered was the smell. I don't know how to write this in a way that doesn't sound like I'm reaching for effect. I'm not. I'm trying to be clinically accurate. The smell that came up from that cavity was the smell of something that had been sealed in airless dark for a very long time. Old paper, yes, but beneath that, something else. Something that registered in some primitive part of my brain as wrong, before my conscious mind had caught up with what I was looking at. It was the smell of old iron, old metal left in a wet place, rust, but biological rust, iron that had once been something other than iron. I looked into the cavity. There was a package, wrapped in newspaper, the way you'd wrap, something breakable, layers of it, yellowed and brittle, the paper so dry it had gone slightly translucent at the folds. It had been wrapped with string, the kind of plain brown cotton string that used to come on kitchen packages from a butcher or a deli counter. The string had discolored over the years, going from whatever color it had been to a brownish grey that matched the paper almost perfectly. Beside the package, folded once, was a photograph. I took the photograph out first, because it was just paper, because a photograph felt manageable, and the package didn't. Even in the dim light filtering from the desk lamp, I could see what it was immediately. My mother. I sat back on my heels, and I held the photograph and I looked at it for a long time. The photograph is 4x6, colour but faded, the way prints from that era fade, shifting toward a warm yellow-orange over time, losing their blues and greens, their shadows softening into a kind of sepia that the original moment never had. The print itself has a slight glossy surface, the old Kodak kind, thicker than modern prints. My mother is standing in a garden, not our garden. I don't recognize the background. She's wearing a yellow dress, short-sleeved, the kind of simple summer dress that's hard to date precisely because that style doesn't go away. Her hair is dark and pulled back, a few strands loose. She's not looking at the camera. She's looking slightly to one side, at something outside the frame, and there's an expression on her face that I've spent 3 weeks trying to name. Not happiness, not unhappiness, something in between. A suspended quality, like a person mid-thought, caught by the camera before they'd arranged themselves for the lens. She looks young. She was young. I've done the math. If this photo is from 1994, she would have been 28. I was 1. In the bottom right corner of the photograph, there's a defect in the print. It looks like a pressure mark, the kind you get when a photograph sits under something heavy for years. But the defect is in a specific shape, a slightly elongated crescent, roughly the size of a thumbnail, and it sits over the lower part of my mother's dress, just at her hip. The pressure has forced the colours in that area to bloom outwards slightly, so there's this halo of deeper orange-yellow around the damaged area, like a bruise spreading through the image, But that's not the detail that stopped me. Behind my mother, slightly out of focus in the way the background goes soft in these old prints, there is a window in whatever structure exists at the edge of the frame. And in the reflection in that window, small, distorted by the angle and the quality of the glass, there is the shape of a person. Not my mother. Someone else. Standing behind the camera. The reflection is not clear. It can't be. The resolution of a 1994 print, the secondary reflection of a background window, you're getting almost no detail, but you can see the rough outline of a figure standing upright with the camera at their face, and you can see that the figure is tall, noticeably tall. The way the reflection scales against the window frame, a person who is well over 6 feet. My father was 6'3". I put the photograph down on the floor beside me. I looked at the package for a while. The newspaper wrapping, I could see this even before I unwrapped it, was from a specific date. The masthead of the Courier Examiner was visible at one edge, and below it, partially obscured by the fold, March 18th, 1994. The headline I could see, the partial one, read, "Governor signs highway funding bill." I knew the Courier Examiner. It was the local county paper that had been publishing since the 1950s. It still publishes now, though it's mostly digital. My father had subscribed to it for as long as I could remember, one of the last people in the county still getting the physical paper. Below the partial headline, slightly lower on the visible section of the wrapping, I could see a smaller item, a photograph, and below the photograph, in the smaller point type used for secondary stories, Senator Leonard Hargrove, a D, addresses County Development Committee on proposed, the rest was folded under. Senator Leonard Hargrove. I knew that name. Everyone in this county knows that name. Leonard Hargrove, who served 3 terms in the state Senate, then ran for and won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives in 2008 and has held that seat, won 3 subsequent elections, most recently in 2024, and currently serves as the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee. The House Judiciary Committee, the body responsible for oversight of federal courts. I'm telling you this calmly. I'm telling you this in a flat, even voice, because that's the only way I can tell it. But I need you to understand the specific, leaden weight of seeing that name on the newspaper wrapped around whatever was in that package. The way certain facts arrange themselves in front of you, and your brain simultaneously understands the arrangement and refuses to accept what it means. I picked up the package. Through the newspaper, I could feel the shape of what was inside. Long and narrow, hard, not flexible, the length of a forearm. The weight of it, even through the paper, was denser than I expected. Not the weight of something merely long and narrow, but the weight of something solid, something that had the specific gravity of metal. I unwrapped it. I want to pause here. I want to pause and say, I knew what it was before I saw it. Something in the weight, the length, the smell that was getting stronger now that I was handling the package. I knew. And I unwrapped it anyway. Because you do, because once you've started, the momentum of the act carries you through the moment of knowing, past, the point where you could still pretend you hadn't opened anything. The newspaper came apart in 3 layers. The inner layer was the most brittle, almost dissolving at the folds, leaving a faint brown powder on my fingers that I didn't want to think about. It was a kitchen knife, a chef's knife, the kind with a wide blade that tapers to a point. 8 inches, maybe. I don't know knives well enough to be more precise than that. The handle was wooden, dark wood, the kind that looks like it was made to last. There were 2 brass rivets through the handle, holding it to the blade. One of the rivets was slightly loose. I noticed this because when I held the knife, the handle shifted slightly in a way that a properly maintained knife wouldn't. And I looked down and saw the gap, the blade. I need to talk about the blade. The blade was not clean. I knew this from the smell, that iron rust smell that had come up from the cavity the moment I'd opened it. The blade had been wiped. Someone had wiped it, thoroughly enough that there were no obvious visible traces in the flat surfaces. But the edge, the cutting edge itself, had collected what time had done with what was left. There was a dark reddish-brown discoloration along the edge of the blade, in the microscopic pits of the steel, the kind of stain that doesn't fully come out when you wipe a blade, the kind that settles into the metal and becomes part of it. Old blood, oxidized, desiccated, pressed into the grain of the steel by time. But blood. I held a knife that had been used on something, on someone, and then wrapped in a newspaper from March 1994 and sealed under the floor of my father's study. My father's study. The room I was not allowed to enter without permission. The room with the Persian rug that was slightly out of place in a house otherwise furnished for function. My father, who was a superior court judge. My father who told me my mother left. My mother, who left in the spring of 1999. That's what he told me. That's what he told me. There was one more thing in the cavity. I almost missed it because it was small and dark, and it had shifted into a corner at some point during the years it had been there. A small object, roughly oval, no bigger than a 50-cent piece. I picked it up and held it under the light from the desk lamp. It was a brooch, enamel on metal. The metal was gold-toned, though I couldn't tell you if it was actually gold, and the enamel work was blue, a blue butterfly, the kind of detailed, delicate enamel work that you'd find in a particular style of jewelry from the 70s and 80s, the blue in multiple shades, lighter at the wingtips and deeper toward the body of the butterfly, the antennae thin lines of black enamel that had mostly survived the years intact. A blue butterfly brooch. I held it in my palm and my hand began to shake. Not dramatically, not the cinematic shake of a protagonist in a thriller. A fine, constant tremor, like a piece of machinery that is slightly out of balance. Because I remembered this brooch. I don't have many memories of my mother. I was 5 when she supposedly left. What I have are fragments, impressions more than memories, sensory residue from an age before the mind develops its filing systems, a smell of something floral, the sound of a particular laugh, not a big laugh, a quiet one contained, the feeling of a hand much smaller than my father's hand, and a blue butterfly, the specific, sharp blue of the butterfly on a piece of jewelry that she wore. I couldn't have told you where she wore it. I couldn't have told you whether it was a brooch or a pin or something else, but I remembered the blue. I remembered looking at it up close, the way children look at small, beautiful things up close, with their whole face. I closed my fingers around the brooch. I sat on the floor of my father's study for a very long time. There are things you can explain away. An old knife under the floorboards, strange, yes, but there are explanations. A man keeps objects for reasons that aren't sinister. A knife from a particular time, wrapped up, stored. Maybe it meant something to him. Maybe it was evidence from a case, maybe a photograph. A man keeps photographs of people who left. Maybe he grieved her in private, in ways he never showed me. Maybe the photograph was a private memorial to something I wasn't supposed to see. A brooch. Maybe she left it behind. Maybe he kept it out of sentiment. I sat on that floor and I cycled through every alternative explanation I could construct. I am not a stupid person. I have, in fact, spent considerable effort in my life constructing alternative explanations for things that made me uncomfortable, because growing up in my father's house taught you to do that, to sand down the rough edges of reality until it fit, the frame he'd built for it. But the newspaper was from March 1994. My mother didn't leave until 1999. That's what he told me. The knife wrapped in a March 1994 newspaper had old blood on the blade. My mother is in a photograph from what appears to be a summer in the mid-90s. My mother, who supposedly walked away and never looked back, never contacted me, never sent a letter or an email or a birthday card for 26 years. I need to stop and say something plainly. I need to say it and let it sit here. I think my mother did not leave. I think my mother is in that photograph, young and looking away from the camera. And I think the tall figure in the reflection in the background window is my father. And I think something happened in or around March 1994 that my father sealed under his floorboards and covered with a Persian rug and buried under 30 years of being a respected, upright, honest man. I think my father killed my mother. I'm going to say that again because the first time I said it to myself, sitting on that floor, the brooch in my hand, the knife wrapped in its brittle newspaper in front of me, I said it and my throat closed so completely that I couldn't speak or swallow, like there was dry sand packed into the back of my throat up into my sinuses. I think my father killed my mother. I think he did it in or around March of 1994. I think he told me she left 5 years later as a cover story for the years she'd been missing before then, because a 5-year-old wouldn't know the difference, and by the time I was old enough to ask real questions, the story had calcified into family history. I think he sealed the evidence under the floor of his own study and lived above it for 26 years. And I think he was protected. Let me walk you through what I did in the days after finding the package. I put everything back in the cavity. I put the photograph, the knife, the brooch back in the space under the floor. And I put the board back down. And I put the rug back over it. I did this automatically, almost without deciding to. Something in my body made the decision before my mind caught up with it. A kind of animal instinct about the danger of having those things visible. Then I sat at my father's desk and I started going through his papers again. More carefully this time, looking for something different. It took me 2 days. What I found was not a confession. My father was not the kind of man who wrote confessions. He was not the kind of man who wrote anything that could be used against him. What I found was negative space, the presence of an absence. In my father's meticulous files, which contained every document from every period of his life, there was a gap. His records from late 1993 through mid-1994 were thin, not empty, but thin in a way that no other comparable period was thin. His datebook for that year, he kept physical datebooks, small, leather-bound things, one per year, and I found nearly all of them in a box in the study, was missing entirely. 1994, gone. Every other year was there, from 1981 through 2023. 1994 was not there. In the files from that period, I found one thing that didn't fit. A receipt, a carbon copy of a receipt, the kind that businesses used to issue before digital records, from a company called Hargrove Land Management. The receipt was for a service I couldn't identify from the description alone. Property remediation and preparation, parcel number 7-441-B, as per agreement. The receipt was dated June 1994. It had been paid in full. Hargrove Land Management. I sat with that for a long time. Then I got online and I started searching. Hargrove Land Management no longer exists as a registered entity. It was dissolved in 2003. But in the online archive of the County Business Registry, which the county digitized a few years back as part of a transparency initiative, there is a registration record for Hargrove Land Management, LLC, filed in November 1993, listed officers, 4 individuals, 2 of whom I didn't recognize, one of whom had a name I recognized as a prominent local real estate developer who died in 2011. The 4th was the company's registered agent, Thomas C. Hargrove, the father of Representative Leonard Hargrove. I'll let that sit for a moment. I'll let you do the math. A company registered by the father of a man who was then a state senator, who is now a US representative on the House Judiciary Committee, was paid by my father for property remediation in June of 1994, approximately 3 months after the date on the newspaper wrapped around the knife. Property remediation. I need to be careful about what I'm saying here. I want to be precise. I don't have enough to prove what I'm suggesting. but I have enough to understand the shape of something. The way you can see the shape of an object submerged in murky water by the way the surface moves around it. I think someone helped him. I think someone cleaned something up in the spring of 1994 and called it property remediation. And I think the family that helped him clean it up has spent the last 30 years being protected in turn by my father's legal decisions, by his influence, by the long, tangled reciprocity of powerful men who hold each other's secrets. And I think that's why Leonard Hargrove became a senator. And I think that's why Leonard Hargrove is now on the House Judiciary Committee. And I think there are other people involved, people I haven't found yet, people whose names I haven't encountered, because the architecture of this kind of protection requires more than two men. There's something else I need to tell you about my father's reputation, something that feels relevant now in a way it didn't before. My father was known, and this was mentioned multiple times at his funeral and is written into essentially every professional profile of him, for what colleagues described as his extraordinary fairness in cases involving domestic matters. Family court cases, custody disputes, cases involving allegations of abuse within the home. He presided over these cases with what was repeatedly described as unusual sensitivity and nuance. He was credited by advocacy organizations, by other judges, by law school professors who cited his written decisions, with bringing a kind of moral clarity to the adjudication of private violence that other judges lacked. He was given an award for it. In 2006, the State Bar Association gave my father an award for his work in developing more rigorous evidential standards for domestic cases. They called it the cornerstone of modern family justice precedent in this state. He accepted the award and gave a speech and was photographed with the governor. I stared at that photograph in the news archive for a long time. A man who had, I believe, buried a knife under his floor for 12 years by that point, standing next to the governor, accepting an award for his exceptional understanding of domestic violence. The inverse of this is so complete, so total, so cleanly constructed, that it stopped feeling like something I could absorb emotionally. It became just a fact, a brutal, inert fact. The kind of thing that your mind refuses to process as feeling and instead catalogues as data because the feeling is too large to fit inside a moment. I called my aunt, my father's younger sister, the only member of his family who is still alive. She is 73 years old and lives in a retirement community 3 hours south of here. We have a cordial relationship, not close, but not distant. She calls on my birthday. I call on hers. We exchanged a few weeks of daily communication after my father died, when there were practical things to coordinate, and then we settled back into the usual rhythm. I called her and I told her I was going through my father's photographs and I'd found some photos that looked like my mother. There was a pause. I want to describe this pause correctly. It wasn't a short pause, the brief hesitation of someone gathering their thoughts. It was a long pause. The kind of pause that has a quality, a texture. The kind that tells you the person on the other end is not deciding what to say so much as deciding whether to say anything at all. She said, "Oh, you found photographs?" Not a question. I said yes. I said they seemed to be from around 1994. I said my mother looked young. Another pause, shorter. She said, "Daniel, your father was a complicated man. I always thought that the best thing for everyone was to let sleeping dogs lie. Let sleeping dogs lie." I kept my voice even. I asked her if she'd known my mother well. She said, "Well enough." I asked when she'd last seen her. The pause came. Back. Longer this time. She said, "I have to go, Daniel. I have a dinner thing. We'll talk soon." She hung up. I haven't been able to reach her since. She doesn't answer calls. She responded to one text message with, "I'm fine, just busy, we'll talk soon." That was 11 days ago. My father's sister, who said, "Let sleeping dogs lie," is now not answering my calls. I need to talk about the car. 12 days after I found the package under the floor, I'd been very careful not to tell anyone about it. I'd been going about my daily routine as normally as I could manage, working remotely from my father's kitchen table, ordering groceries online, not leaving the house more than I had to. I noticed a car parked on the street in front of the house. A dark blue sedan, American make, newer model, clean and anonymous. The kind of car that says nothing about its driver. Government plates. I noticed it because it was there at 7 in the morning when I came downstairs for coffee, and it was still there at noon when I looked out the window to check whether the mail had come, and it was still there at 4 in the afternoon, and at 7 that evening, and when I got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom and happened to look out through the curtain at the top of the stairs. The next morning, it was gone. 3 days later, it was back. Different position, further down the street, angled slightly differently, but the same car, same plates. I got close enough to read the full plate number. I wrote it down. I want to be very careful about how I describe my mental state here because I am aware of how this sounds. I am aware that there is a version of this where a man who has found a traumatic object in his dead father's house and has been processing a significant psychological shock begins to see patterns that aren't there. I've thought about this. I've interrogated my own perceptions carefully, but here is what I can tell you with certainty. The car was there. I photographed it on 2 separate occasions, from the upstairs window, at angles that show the plate clearly. Those photographs exist. I will not share them here for reasons I'll explain. And here is what else I can tell you. After the second instance of the car, I started paying more attention to things I might previously have dismissed, and I noticed 3 other things in the following 2 weeks. First, my internet router logs showed repeated external access attempts to my home network, my father's old network, which I'd inherited along with the house, with his original setup, on 7 separate evenings between midnight and 4 a.m. I'm not a cybersecurity expert. I don't know exactly what this means. What I know is that when I installed a new router and changed all the passwords and mentioned this to a friend who does work in network security, he went quiet in a way that told me it wasn't nothing. Second, a man knocked on my front door on a Tuesday afternoon and introduced himself as representing a property management company interested in purchasing the house if I was considering selling. He was professionally dressed. He gave me a business card with a company name I later tried to search online and found essentially no digital footprint for, a company name that resolved to a blank website with a contact form and no other content. He was friendly and unremarkable, and there was nothing I could definitively identify as wrong about him, except that he knew my name. He said, "Mr. Calloway," before I'd introduced myself, which is something I noticed at the time and dismissed, and which I stopped being able to dismiss later. Third, the package under the floor. I had replaced the board and the rug after I found the contents. I was precise about how I replaced it. I'm a careful person. I noticed where things were before I moved them. I made sure to restore everything to its original position. When I went back to check on the cavity 2 weeks after the initial discovery, because I had started to think about what to do with what was inside, who I could trust to take it to. The rug was slightly different. Not dramatically different. Not moved, not visibly disturbed. A slight difference in the angle at which it lay over the floor. The fringe at the nearest edge was overlapping the baseboard in a way it hadn't been before. Someone had moved the rug. Someone had been in this house and moved the rug and replaced it close enough to its original position that they expected I wouldn't notice. But they hadn't noticed what I'd noticed about the fringe, or they'd decided the margin of error was acceptable. Someone had come into this house and looked under the rug and found the replaced board and knew that I knew, and then replaced the rug and left. I need to talk about what I did next. I copied everything. The photographs I'd taken, the receipt I'd found, the business registration records from the county archive, the router logs. I copied everything and I sent it to 3 different cloud storage locations under accounts that are not connected to my name or my devices, and I printed physical copies and mailed them to 3 physical locations. a trusted friend in another state, a safety deposit box in a bank in a town 2 hours from here that I'd opened under circumstances that don't bear explaining in this video, and one other location that I'm not disclosing. This is called a dead man's switch, roughly speaking. If something happens to me, the information goes somewhere. I did this not because I think I'm a protagonist in a thriller. I did this because a car with government plates sat outside my house for a full day. Because someone came into my house. Because my aunt stopped answering my calls after I mentioned the photographs. Because the man whose secrets I may have found was a superior court judge with 30 years of relationships with law enforcement, with prosecutors, with politicians, with the infrastructure of the legal system in this county and beyond. Because the other man whose name is on that newspaper, Leonard Hargrove, is currently a sitting member of Congress with significant oversight influence over the federal judiciary. Because property remediation is a phrase that I can't stop turning over in my head. Because I have a brooch that belonged to my mother, and my mother has not been seen or heard from in 26 years, and there are no missing persons reports filed for her in this county or any adjacent county, and I've checked 3 times and there is nothing. No missing persons report. For a woman who supposedly got up and left and was never seen again. My father, the Superior Court judge, did not file a missing persons report for his wife. I want to tell you something about grief, because I think it's important, and I haven't seen it discussed in a way that matches my experience. When you grieve a parent, even a parent you had a difficult relationship with, even a parent who was cold or demanding or absent in ways that shaped you painfully, there is a quality of finality to it that is, in a horrible way, almost clean. They are gone. Whatever you didn't resolve between you is now permanently unresolvable, and there is grief in that. But there is also a kind of terrible clarity. The relationship is over. You can begin to see it for what it was. What I'm experiencing now is different. What I'm experiencing is a retroactive revision of an entire history. Not just my father's history, my own. The story of my own life. The story I've been living inside is being rewritten from underneath with information that changes the meaning of everything that already happened. I was raised by a man I now believe murdered my mother. I grieved my mother. I grieved her absence. I grieved the abandonment. I processed the wound of her leaving. I sat in a therapist's office and worked through what it means to be left by a parent. I came to something like acceptance, all on the basis of a lie. The grief I did was for the wrong thing. I don't have a word for this. I've looked for one, and I don't think it exists. The feeling of having grieved incorrectly, of having mourned an absence when you should have been mourning a death, of having processed abandonment when what happened was murder, the specific psychological structure of this is something I don't think language has caught up with. I find myself sitting in rooms in this house and looking at objects and recalibrating their meaning. The photograph on the mantelpiece of my father and me at my college graduation, me in my cap and gown, him in a dark suit, his hand on my shoulder, both of us unsmiling in the particular way of people who are not natural photographers. I used to look at this photograph and feel the complicated feelings of a child who loved his parent imperfectly and was imperfectly loved in return. Now I look at it and I see a man who had been living above his wife's secret for a decade by that point, and I don't know how to feel anything about it except a dull, flat horror that has no edges. He came to my graduation. He sat through my ceremony. He took me to dinner afterward. He ordered the Dover sole and drank 1 glass of wine and asked about my plans for after graduation. He was proud of me, genuinely, I believe. The pride was real. The same brain that produced that genuine pride had, 10 years earlier, wrapped a knife in newspaper and put it under a floor. Both things are true, and I don't know how to hold both things in the same mind simultaneously without one of them forcing the other out. I need to tell you why I'm making this video. I've thought about going to the police. I've spent considerable time thinking about going to the police, The problem, and it's not a small problem, is that the police in this county, the county where my father served for 30 years, where his relationships with law enforcement are deep and structural, where the current DA was his former clerk, the police in this county are not a neutral party in this story. I've thought about going to the FBI, the federal level outside the local structure, and I haven't dismissed this, I haven't ruled it out. But the man whose name is on the newspaper wrapped around the knife is now a ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, which means he sits on the committee that oversees the Justice Department, which means his influence, if he chose to exercise it, extends into the federal investigative structure as well. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I want to say that again because I'm aware of how this sounds, and I need you to believe me when I say I've interrogated every step of this logic. I'm a 31-year-old man who freelances in technical writing and has no particular reason to fabricate any of this, and significant reasons to stay quiet. But I also have a blue butterfly brooch that belonged to my mother, found sealed under a floorboard with a knife that has old blood on the blade, wrapped in a newspaper with a sitting congressman's family name on it, in the house of a man who told me for 26 years that my mother chose to leave. And someone has been in this house, and my aunt has stopped answering my calls. I want to find my mother. I want that to be possible. I want there to be a version of this where she is alive somewhere, where she left for reasons that were real and complicated and human, where the knife has some other explanation and the photograph has some other meaning, and the brooch was left behind on purpose as some kind of object of closure. I want that version to exist. I sit with the photograph sometimes. The one I took, copies of. I made prints, I have them, and I look at my mother's face, 28 years old, looking at something outside the frame, and I try to understand what she was thinking about in that moment. What was outside the frame that held her attention? Whether she knew already in that spring of 1994, whether there was something in her expression that was the expression of someone who understood they were in danger. I can't tell. The quality of the old photograph doesn't give me enough resolution in her face to know what I'm seeing. I look at it, and I see someone who looks like a version of what I imagine I'd look like. There's a family resemblance that hits me every time, around the eyes and the set of the jaw. And I cannot tell if what she's feeling is ordinary or terminal. The damaged area of the photograph, the pressure mark in the shape of a crescent at her hip. Sometimes I look at that and see a bruise. I know it isn't. I know it's a photographic defect. But the brain finds shapes, and the shape it finds in that damage is a bruise, and I can't unsee it. I want to tell you something about my father that I think is the hardest part of all of this. He was a good father to me, imperfect, cold in ways that cost me, demanding in ways that cost me, incapable of the emotional fluency that a child needs, and that I, consequently, have spent my adult life learning in his absence. But present, consistent, he showed up. He did the work of parenthood with the same methodical competence he brought to everything: school events, doctor's appointments, help with homework, the careful choreography of raising a child while running a demanding career, all of it done alone by him, without complaint. He loved me. I believe that. I believe it genuinely and without qualification. And I believe he killed my mother. And I believe he looked me in the eyes on hundreds of occasions across 30 years and told me she left, and told me she was selfish, and told me that some people aren't built for the long road. He said that phrase multiple times. I can hear him saying it in a specific register that he used for what he thought of as hard truths, a kind of measured firmness, and he said it knowing what he knew. The person who loved me and the person who did that are the same person. That is the thing I cannot find a way around. I've tried. I've constructed frameworks, psychological theories, compartmentalization models, the idea of a person divided against themselves, the idea of a person who buried something so completely that it stopped affecting the surface life. And none of it resolves the central impossibility, which is that the man who held my hand at my first day of school had a knife under the floor of his study and told me my mother chose to leave. I don't know what to do with this. I don't know what the right action is. I don't know who the right person is to take this to. I don't know how to pursue what happened to my mother through systems that her husband helped build and that are populated at significant levels by people who may have known, people who may have helped. I don't know if making this video is smart. I genuinely don't. There is a real possibility that the best strategy, the safest strategy, would have been to say nothing, to take whatever I found and put it somewhere secure and go on with my life and let the dead stay buried. But I can't do that. I can't do it because she's my mother. Because I spent 26 years thinking she didn't want me. And I have reason to believe now that what actually happened is that she didn't get the choice. And I can't let the story stay the one my father told me. I can't let his version be the final version. So I'm telling you. I'm telling whoever is watching this. I'm putting the shape of this thing into words and sending it out into a world where it can't be unsaid. I'm still in the house. I've thought about leaving. I've thought about it every day since I found the package. But leaving feels like something they're waiting for. Whoever they are. The car outside, the person who moved the rug. Leaving feels like a concession, like agreeing that the house and what's in it can be managed without me here. So I stay. Every night I listen to the house settle. Old houses make a lot of noise, the thermal expansion and contraction of wood, the minor shifts of a structure adjusting to changes in temperature and humidity, the specific creaks and pops that are the house's version of breathing. I've come to know the sounds this house makes. I know which sounds are routine and which are not. Last Thursday, at approximately 2:15 in the morning, there was a sound from the direction of the study that was not routine. A single, low creak. The sound of weight on the floor. I lay in bed and I listened, and there was nothing after it. No follow-up. No sequence of sounds that would indicate movement. Nothing to confirm that what I'd heard was what I thought it was. After about 10 minutes, I got up and went to the study door and stood outside it with my hand on the doorknob. The door was closed. I opened it. The room was empty. The rug was in place. The desk was as I'd left it. Everything was still. But the smell. For just a moment, brief enough that I immediately began questioning whether I'd imagined it. There was the smell of outside air in that room. Cold night air carrying the faint mineral smell of recent rain. The smell of a room in which, very recently, a door or window had been briefly open. All the windows in the study were locked. I check them every night. I stood in the center of the room for a long time, on top of the rug, on top of the replaced floorboard, on top of the cavity and what it contains. I stood there and I thought about my father standing in that room for 30 years. I thought about the specific quality of confidence you would need, the specific architecture of certainty, to stand above something like that every day and look at yourself in the mirror each morning and believe that you were the conscience of the county. I thought about the photograph, my mother's face in 3/4 profile, looking at something I can't see. I thought about the brooch in my copy box, a small, bright piece of blue and gold enamel. The butterfly, perfect and preserved, the years having been kind to it in a way they were not kind to other things in that space. I thought, she wore this. She touched this. She pinned it to something she was wearing on a morning in some year in the early 90s, and she did not know that the man she lived with was going to pin it under his floor. I thought, she was real. She was a person. She had a face and a laugh and a brooch shaped like a butterfly, and she was my mother, and she deserved more than to become an absence. And then I went back to bed, and I did not sleep. I don't know how this ends. That's the honest answer, and I'm giving it to you directly because I think you deserve directness, especially if you've stayed with this to the end, and especially because one of the things I've been thinking about is what it means to tell a story that isn't finished. I'm investigating. I'm being careful. I have the physical objects, the knife, the photograph, the brooch, in a location that is not in this house. I have documentation. I have somewhere a forensic specialist who has agreed to look at the blade in exchange for a significant portion of what remains of my inheritance after the estate was settled, and who understands the sensitivity of what they're examining. That analysis is pending. I have a journalist's name, someone who has written about Leonard Hargrove before, not about this, but about other aspects of his career, and who has, in the writing, demonstrated a quality of independence that makes me think they might be willing to look at what I have. I haven't contacted them yet. I'm waiting for the forensic analysis. I have a copy of the photograph in 3 separate secure locations. I have a blue butterfly brooch that, if the blade analysis comes back the way I think it's going to come back, is a piece of physical evidence connecting my father to the death of my mother, in a house in which Senator Hargrove's family company was paid for property remediation approximately 90 days after the date on the newspaper. I'm 31 years old. I'm sitting in my dead father's house. I'm sleeping above a floor that I know the history of now, the history that was always there, that I walked across for 30 years without knowing. The house is quiet tonight. The street outside is empty. No blue sedan, for now. I don't know what's coming. I don't know who's watching this or what comes from having said these words out loud. There is a version of this where I'm overreading a collection of objects that have a mundane explanation I haven't found yet. There is a version where I'm correct, and the structures that protected my father are too deep to be moved by anything I can do. There is also a version where telling the truth, however dangerous, is the right thing to do regardless of outcome. My father spent 30 years building a reputation on the idea that there are universal standards of justice, that the law, properly applied, represents something real, a genuine moral commitment to accountability that transcends individual interest. He said things like that. In the decisions I've read, in the speeches, he believed, or performed the belief, I can no longer tell which, that justice was not merely procedural, but moral, that it demanded something from the people who administered it. He was, in that sense, a man who understood exactly what he owed and chose not to pay it. Think about that a lot. I think about what it means to be his son, to carry his name, his legal name, the name that appears in the law school case studies and the Bar Association commendations and the county court records. I think about what I owe. The photograph is in a safe place. The brooch is in a safe place. The knife is in a safe place. I'm still in the house. I'm still looking. If anything happens to me, and I say this plainly, without drama, as a practical statement of fact, the information I've described is in locations and in the hands of people who know what to do with it. My mother's name was Claire Marie Calloway, née Beaumont. She was born in 1966. She was 28 years old in the summer of 1994 when someone took a photograph of her looking at something just outside the frame, standing in a garden I don't recognize, wearing a yellow dress. She deserved better than to be erased. This is the least I can give her. My name is Daniel Calloway. If you know anything about my mother, about 1994, about anyone connected to Raymond Calloway or Leonard Hargrove or Hargrove Land Management or property remediation at a parcel in this county in the spring of that year, there is a contact address in the description of this video. Use it. I'll be back when I know more.